Justice for Judge Eleanor Vance wasn't a thunderclap. It was the dry, rhythmic click of a gavel, the rustle of a file being closed, the quiet dismissal of one human problem after another. For 28 years, her courtroom had been a model of ruthless efficiency, a place where sentiment was a liability and speed was a virtue. She was unshakable, a fortress of procedure in a world of messy emotions, until the morning a man stood before her, his silence more potent than any argument. She fined him without looking up another name on a docket, another life processed through the machine. He didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, a quiet island in her turbulent river of cases, and in his stillness, the foundations of her world began to crack, because he wasn't who she thought he was. And the truth of his identity was a lesson that would unravel everything she thought she knew about power, presence, and the woman she had become. The day began, as they all did, in the pre-dawn chill of the courthouse parking lot. Eleanor stepped out of her modest sedan, the air sharp enough to bite. Her heels clicked against the concrete with a clipped, metronomic rhythm that matched the pace of her thoughts. Her briefcase, filled with the day's burdens, swung low and steady. Her lips were pressed into a familiar hard line, not of anger, but of discipline. It was the face she had perfected over decades, a mask forged in the fires of a legal world that hadn't been built for women like her. She had learned early on to walk faster than doubt and to hold her expression like stone, especially when she wanted to crumble. Inside the courthouse smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the stale, recycled air of 1,000 settled arguments. It was the smell of time compressed. She gave the security guard a perfunctory nod, not waiting for his reply. The long hallway was a gallery of ghosts, lined with the portraits of her predecessors, all men, all grey-haired, all staring down with an air of possessive authority. She ran her fingers along the sleeve of her robe as she walked the heavy fabric, a familiar armor. It made her Judge Vance. It made her untouchable. Her courtroom was quiet, bathed in the faint, mechanical hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. It was a sound only she seemed to notice, the pulse of the machine she commanded. She placed her files on the bench with a soft, definitive thud and sat, exhaling not from fatigue, but from the familiar pressure of expectation. David the bailiff stood sentinel by the door, his eyes kind, but watchful. The clerk, Maria, adjusted her glasses, murmuring about the morning's docket. Eleanor gave a short, sharp nod, her gaze already locked on the first page. "Let's begin," she said, her voice smooth and firm, the sound of inevitability. She barely registered the name Silas Kane. Just another line of text, another man who had made a poor choice and now found himself in the gravitational pull of her judgment. When he stepped forward, she didn't lift her eyes from the report. Trespassing, found asleep in the lobby of a municipal building just after midnight. No prior record, no resistance. A simple open and shut case, but the silence stretched. It was a small thing, a beat longer than usual, but it was enough to make the air in the room feel different. Maria's fingers hovered over her keyboard. David shifted his weight. Eleanor finally looked up, her focus snagged by the stillness. There he stood, a man in his late 50s, tall and lean. His skin was dark, lined with the kind of age that spoke of experience, not weariness. He was dressed in a simple dark jacket and slacks clothes that were too neat, too deliberate for someone sleeping rough. A faded canvas bag was slung over one shoulder, soft and worn like a lifelong companion, but it was his expression that was so disarming. It was utterly neutral, not defiant, not afraid, not even apologetic, just present. He was simply completely there. It was a stillness that felt almost alien in a room built on conflict. "Mr. Kane," Eleanor said, her tone clipped efficient. "You were found on government property after hours. Do you have an explanation?" He nodded once. His voice, when it came, was calm and low. "I missed the last bus, Your Honor. It was cold. I meant no harm." The words were plain, unadorned. No excuses, no dramatic pleas. Just a statement of fact. Eleanor's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the fine, closing the file. She tapped her pen against the desk. Trespassing in this facility carries a mandatory fine of $750. She stated, her voice devoid of inflection. "Payment is due within 30 days. Next case?" She was already reaching for the next file before he had even turned to leave. He nodded again, that same quiet acceptance on his face. As he stepped back, his canvas bag swung forward slightly. For a split second, something inside, a piece of polished metal, caught the light. Eleanor saw the glint, but her brain dismissed it, filing it under irrelevant details. As he passed David on his way out, the bailiff's eyes lingered on the man, a flicker of professional curiosity in his gaze. But he said nothing. The door clicked shut, and the courtroom's rhythm resumed. Names were called, fines were levied, lives were sorted and stamped and filed away. But the echo of that man's silence remained. It was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've missed the most important part of the conversation. Eleanor's hand hesitated over the next file, her pen hovering, suspended in a moment of unnamed doubt. For the first time in a long time, the machine had skipped a beat. Outside, Silas Kane stepped into the sharp morning light. He moved with a slow, measured grace, a man long accustomed to observing the world without being seen by it. The courthouse hallway was dim, but his eyes, alert and analytical, scanned every corner, every shadow. He wasn't just leaving, he was assessing. The fine was an annoyance, nothing more. What truly stung was the casual indifference the swift mechanical judgment rendered without a flicker of human curiosity. He had stood before her, a citizen, a man, and she had seen only a docket number, a problem to be processed. He reached the end of the hall where a security guard offered a nod that held a hint of a question. "Cold one?" the guard said. "It is." Silas replied, his voice even before pushing through the heavy glass doors. The city's noise washed over him, distant traffic, the clatter of a delivery truck, the call of birds. He paused by a concrete bench, not to sit, but to let the world settle around him. His breath plumed in the cold air. He reached into his worn canvas bag, his fingers brushing past a small notebook and a well-used fountain pen, before they grazed the cool, familiar metal of his credentials, clipped to an inner pocket. Assistant Inspector General, United States Department of Justice. He didn't pull the badge out. There was no need. It wasn't a shield to be brandished. It was a responsibility to be carried. He wasn't bitter. Bitterness was a luxury, a waste of energy he couldn't afford. But a deep, abiding weariness settled in his bones. It was the old familiar ache of knowing that in so many rooms, in so many systems, the first thing people saw was a stereotype, not a man. The first assumption was weakness, not weight. Back inside, Courtroom 3, the machine was humming along, but a gear had been stripped. David, the bailiff, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "That guy," he murmured to Maria, the clerk. "He didn't feel like a trespasser." Maria shrugged, her focus already on the next case file. She was conditioned to the judge's rhythm, fast, clean, no pauses. But David kept watching the door, a frown pulling at the corner of his mouth. Across the street, Silas waited for the crosswalk light to change. A woman rushed past her eyes, glued to her phone, completely oblivious to his presence. Most people were. Unless he spoke first, unless he flashed the badge, he was invisible. And even then, sometimes all they saw was the title, scrambling, to adjust their perception of the man they had already dismissed. The light changed. He crossed the street, his steps steady, and even a quiet punctuation in the story of his day. He didn't look back at the courthouse. There was nothing there to see. The judgment had been passed, the observation made. What mattered now was what came next. And sooner or later, someone would realize what had been overlooked. Sometimes they never did. But sometimes, just sometimes, a man's quiet presence could leave an echo louder and more lasting than any sentence a judge could hand down. It began, as these things always do, with a whisper. A quiet comment dropped into the stale air of the courthouse break room, a seed of doubt planted over the hiss of the coffee machine. The morning dockets had concluded, and the room filled with the low hum of chatter and the clinking of ceramic mugs. Maria, the clerk from Eleanor's court, was the first to give the feeling a voice. "Strangest thing," she said more to herself than anyone, "that man the judge fined this morning for trespassing. I'm sure I've seen his face before." The comment hung in the air, waiting. David, the bailiff, leaned against the counter, his arms folded, his eyes narrowed. Tall guy, carried that old canvas bag like it was important. Maria nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think he spoke at that federal justice symposium last year. He was an inspector or something with the DOJ. Her words weren't a statement of fact, but a question. And the question was enough to change the room's atmosphere. The casual chatter subsided. Across the counter, Janice from the district attorney's office stopped stirring her coffee. "You're not talking about Silas Kane, are you?" The name landed with an unexpected thud. "Because if that's who you mean, then yeah, I've seen him too, Silas Kane." The name wasn't just a name, it was a reputation. It was the man whose internal review had forced a statewide audit of police evidence rooms. The man who had quietly dismantled a corruption ring in a neighboring county without a single press conference. He was known precisely because he never sought the spotlight. His name appearing in your inbox was a quiet harbinger of doom for someone powerful who had been caught cutting corners. The whispers and wondering are the lifeblood of any bureaucracy, the nervous system that transmits warnings and gossip with equal speed. A story like this, a story about a potential misstep by a judge as formidable as Eleanor Vance, is more than just gossip. It's a seismic event. If you've ever been part of a community where reputation is everything you know, the power of a story that starts to unravel it. To follow every detail of this unfolding drama and the stories of quiet courage that change the world, make sure you subscribe to our channel. I saw a badge. David finally said, his voice low, almost a confession, tucked in a pocket of that bag as he walked out. I didn't get a clean look, so I didn't say anything. But now, he let the sentence hang unfinished. No one needed him to finish it. The implication was already racing through their minds. If the Judge Vance, had just fined the legendary Silas Kane for trespassing, treating him like a common drifter, then something had gone terribly fundamentally wrong. Back in her chambers, Eleanor sat at her desk, a pen held motionless between her fingers. She was oblivious to the whispers. She didn't yet know the weight of the name she had so casually dismissed. But she felt it. A low-grade, persistent unease, a tightness in her shoulders that hadn't been there that morning. By early afternoon, the rumor had become a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the entire courthouse. No one spoke of it openly, but the knowledge was there in the way staffers' eyes darted away when Eleanor passed in the hall, in the way conversations abruptly stopped and then restarted with forced enthusiasm. She sensed the shift, the subtle change in atmospheric pressure that signals a coming storm. She mistook it for the usual workplace tension, but her instincts, buried under years of judicial armor, pricked at her. Something was wrong. In the records room, someone had pulled up an article on their phone from a legal journal. It was a list of recent appointments to a federal oversight committee. And there was his photo. Silas Kane. "That's him," a young paralegal whispered, holding up the screen. "That's the guy she fined." The silence that followed was heavy, with a single unspoken thought. Judge Vance hadn't seen him. She hadn't looked. And maybe that mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. That evening, long after the courthouse had emptied into a hollow, echoing shell of its daytime self, Eleanor sat alone in her office. The amber glow of her desk lamp pooled on a stack of files she hadn't touched. Her reflection stared back from the dark glass of the window, a tired, drawn woman who looked older than she had felt just 12 hours ago. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture of weariness she only allowed herself in private. Reaching into her briefcase, her fingers brushed against the crisp, pale green copy of the citation. Darius Rowe, the name she had typed. But the face she remembered was Silas Kane. Her stomach tightened. She flipped open her laptop, an itch of professional duty compelling her to confirm what a deeper instinct already knew. She typed in the name Silas Kane. The first headline hit her like a physical blow. Inspector General Silas Kane to lead federal inquiry into judicial misconduct. Her hands froze. The room seemed to shrink. She clicked link after link, each one a nail in the coffin of her composure. The man she had dismissed, the man whose simple explanation she had ignored, was not just a federal agent. He was one of the most respected and feared internal investigators in the country, a man whose name she had seen on memos, whose work she had read about, whose reputation for quiet, meticulous integrity was legendary. She sank back in her chair, the weight of her oversight crashing down on her. It wasn't the mistake itself that was so damning. It was the ease with which she had made it. The machine of her courtroom, the one she had perfected for speed and efficiency, had completely overwritten her judgment, her perception, her simple human duty to see the person standing before her. She pulled open a desk drawer and retrieved a program from a legal symposium she had skipped 2 years ago. Flipping through the pages, her eyes landed on a photo under the heading, "The Power of Presence in Federal Oversight." It was him, Silas Kane. What unsettled her most was how natural it had felt, how reflexively she had reached for the routine, for the swift, impersonal rendering of a decision. She hadn't been a judge in that moment. She had been a processor, sitting alone in the deepening dark. She wasn't just remembering his name. She was hearing the profound quiet in his voice, feeling the weight of his stillness. He hadn't corrected her. He hadn't flashed his badge. He hadn't needed to prove anything. His power wasn't in his title. It was in his presence, and she had been utterly blind to it. I should have looked up, she whispered to the empty room. Then she turned off the lamp and sat in the shadows, her own footsteps echoing in her mind, each one sounding hollow and out of tune. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Eleanor found herself on the edge of her living room couch, a law journal unopened in her lap, the television flickering unnoticed. The house was filled with a stillness that amplified memory. Her mind drifted back nearly 30 years to her second year on the bench. An older male attorney, dismissive and arrogant, had called her young lady in open court after she overruled his objection. The courtroom had gone silent with discomfort. She had held her face like a mask of glass refusing to show a single crack, and had calmly threatened him with contempt. That was the day she started building the fortress. That was the day she decided that efficiency was her best defense, that a rapid, decisive pace would leave no room for anyone to question her authority or mistake her composure for weakness. It had worked. For decades, it had worked. But tonight, that long-ago victory felt like a profound loss. She thought of Silas Kane, standing before her unassuming calm. He hadn't demanded her respect, he simply embodied it. And she, in her armor of efficiency, had failed to see it. It wasn't just that she hadn't recognized him, it was that she hadn't looked long enough to even try. Her phone buzzed, a message from her daughter Ava. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. You good?" Eleanor stared at the screen. The simple question, feeling impossibly complex. "All good," she typed back. "Just tired." A familiar lie. She thought about adding more about the strange weight of the day, but she didn't know how. The walls she had built to protect her professional life had also isolated her personal one. "Okay," Ava replied. "We'll talk soon." "Yes," Eleanor typed, a sudden ache in her chest. "I'd like that." She set the phone down. The badge Silas carried, she could see the glint in her mind's eye. He hadn't used it. He hadn't needed to. That was what haunted her. He had offered her a chance to be a judge, to be a human, to simply look and see. And she had failed the test. The quiet of her home felt less like peace and more like an indictment. A question began to form in the silence, not loud, but persistent. What else have I missed? The next morning, the courthouse air was thick with unspoken words. Eleanor walked the halls, feeling the subtle shift. It was in the way people's eyes met hers and then quickly darted away. It was in the hushed conversations that abruptly ended as she approached. She was an island, and the tide of rumor was rising around her. In her chambers, her clerk Rita had a file waiting. Full summary on Silas Kane from the DOJ internal database. Rita said, her voice carefully neutral. 16 major federal cases since 2017. Do you want the highlights? Leave it. Eleanor said, her own voice sounding distant. I'll read it all. She spent the next hour immersed in the quiet, methodical brilliance of his work. The reports were masterpieces of logic and precision. The man she had brushed aside was a titan of his field. The realization was a slow, crushing weight. It was Friday afternoon when the manila envelope arrived, slid onto her desk by Rita without a word. The label was simple: Judicial Review Submission. From the office of Assistant Inspector General Silas T. Kane. Her breath caught. For a long moment, she just stared at it. The envelope a physical manifestation of her failure. Finally, she slid a finger under the flap and pulled out 2 typed pages. There was no accusation, no anger. The language was crisp, direct, and devastating in its objectivity. During my appearance before Judge Vance, it began, I was issued a citation without the opportunity to provide context or explanation. While I respect the efficiency of municipal proceedings, I believe the circumstances highlight a need for renewed attention to procedural discretion, particularly in how assumptions can shape outcomes before a full picture is presented. I submit this not as a grievance, but as a reminder of what is at stake when we allow systems to move faster than people. She read it 3 times. He could have destroyed her career. He could have gone to the press. He could have made her a cautionary tale. Instead, he had offered her a mirror. He had held her accountable, not with a hammer, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the phone. She dialed the number at the bottom of the letter, a direct line to his office. When he answered, his voice was as calm and even as she remembered. Inspector Kane. She began her own voice, tight. This is Judge Vance. I read your letter. There was a pause on the line, not of triumph, but of patient waiting. And I meant every word, he said softly. I know, she whispered. The armor was cracking. I made a mistake, not in the fine, but in everything else. I'm not calling as a judge. I'm calling as someone who forgot to look up. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice came again, softer this time, with a hint of something that sounded like empathy. Thank you for saying that, Judge. Most people wouldn't. Growth rarely makes noise, he added after another beat. But sometimes the smallest admissions can change the biggest rooms. When the call ended, it wasn't with resolution, but with acknowledgement. And for Eleanor, that was where the change began. 3 days later, Eleanor slipped into the back row of a federal courtroom downtown. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. On the docket was a high-profile hearing in a complex fraud case. Arguing for the government was Silas Kane. She watched unnoticed as he dismantled a defense witness with a series of quiet, surgically precise questions. He never raised his voice. He never postured. His power was in his preparation, his clarity, his unwavering presence. He commanded the room not with volume, but with the sheer force of his competence. When a recess was called, he gathered his notes, and as if sensing her, his eyes briefly lifted and met hers across the crowded room. There was no judgment in his gaze, no accusation, just a simple, quiet acknowledgement. Then he turned and left with his team. Eleanor sat for a long time after the courtroom had emptied, the silence thick with revelation. She had fined that man. She had dismissed that mind, that presence, that quiet dignity without a second thought. The following Monday, the courthouse routine began as usual, but Judge Vance did not. She walked the halls more slowly. She greeted the bailiff by name. She asked her clerk about her family. When the first defendant of the day stood before her, a young woman cited for expired registration. Eleanor didn't just look at the file. She looked at the person. "Tell me what's going on," she said gently. The young woman, startled, explained her mother's medical bills, her late paycheck, her intention to pay as soon as she could. Eleanor listened, and for the first time in years, she felt the space between the law and a human life. Let's set a payment date that works for you, Eleanor said. We'll waive the late penalty. Just get it taken care of. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. It wasn't about the waived fee. It was about the presence, the moment of grace. It was the sound of a judge listening. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of Courtroom 3 was irrevocably altered. The pace was still efficient, but it was no longer rushed. There was a pause between each case, a breath. Eleanor's questions were different. Can you explain what led you here? Had replaced. You've been cited for. It wasn't a reinvention. It was a rediscovery. She was still a judge, but she was a person first. One evening, as she was leaving her chambers, a plain ivory card was delivered. There was no sender, just a single handwritten line inside. Sometimes justice doesn't need volume. It just needs to show up. She knew who it was from. She placed the card on her desk, next to the photo of her swearing-in ceremony. Back then, she thought justice was about control. Now she was learning it was about connection. This story isn't about a dramatic downfall or a public shaming. It's about the quiet, difficult, and beautiful process of transformation. It's a reminder that true strength isn't in the armor we wear, but in our willingness to take it off. True wisdom isn't in never making a mistake, but in having the courage to grow from the ones we do. Whether we're a judge in a courtroom or a person in line at the grocery store, we all face moments where we can choose efficiency over empathy, assumption over attention. The quiet dignity of a man like Silas Kane and the humbling journey of a woman like Judge Eleanor Vance remind us that the most powerful thing we can ever do is to simply be present, to slow down, to look up, and to truly see the person standing in front of us. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of stories that explore our shared humanity, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, because the most important stories are often the quietest ones, and their echoes can change the world.